The incorporation of Tibet into the People's Republic of China, also known in Chinese historiography as the Peaceful Liberation of Tibet, is the process by which the People's Republic of China gained control of the area comprising the present-day Tibet Autonomous Region. These same regions came under the control of China after attempts by the Government of Tibet to gain international recognition. Efforts to modernize its military, negotiations between the Government of Tibet and the PRC, a military conflict in the Qamdo area of Western Kham in October 1950, and the eventual acceptance of the 17-point agreement by the Government of Tibet under Chinese pressure in October 1951. The Government of Tibet and Tibetan social structure remained in place in the Ta under the authority of China until the 1959 Tibetan uprising, when the Dalai Lama fled into exile and after which the Government of Tibet was dissolved. Background: in 1853, the British Empire conquered Sikkim, in 1865 invaded Bhutan, and in 1885 colonized Burma, occupying by force the whole southern flank of Tibet. The Tibetan Ganden Phodrang regime, which was then under administrative rule of the Qing dynasty, remained the only Himalayan regime free of British influence. During most of the 19th century, the British government dealt with Tibet through the Chinese government, which maintained a protectorate over Tibet through Qing representatives or ambans. The British invasion of Tibet in 1903 caused the flight of the Dalai Lama to Mongolia and then to China. After the invasion, the Treaty of Lhasa was signed in 1904 between the remaining authorities in Tibet and Colonel Younghusband, essentially converting Tibet into a British protectorate with some degree of independence. London, however, was aghast at the initiative undertaken by Younghusband and his sponsor, Lord Curzon, and sought to placate the Manchu Qing government by disavowing much of the settlement, resulting in the Anglo-Chinese Convention of 1906. After the fall of the Qing dynasty and the Xinhai-Lhasa turmoil in 1912, the regions of Yusang and Western Kham, comprising the present-day Ta, were then under the control of the Government of Tibet, supervised by the British. In 1913, shortly after the British invasion of Tibet in 1904, the creation of the position of British trade agent at Gyansa and the Xinhai Revolution in 1911, most of the area comprising the present-day Tibetan Autonomous Region became de facto independent from the rest of present-day China under a British protectorate, with the rest of the present-day Ta coming under Tibetan government rule by 1917. Some border areas with high ethnic Tibetan populations remain under Kuomintang, a local warlord control. The Ta region is also known as political Tibet, while all areas with a high ethnic Tibetan population are collectively known as ethnic Tibet. Political Tibet refers to the polity ruled continuously by the Chinese and Tibetan governments since earliest times down to 1951, whilst ethnic Tibet refers to regions north and east where Tibetans historically predominated but where, down to modern times, Tibetan jurisdiction was irregular and limited to just certain areas. At the time political Tibet obtained de facto independence, its socio-economic and political systems resembled medieval Europe. Attempts by the 13th Dalai Lama between 1913 and 1933 to enlarge and modernize the Tibetan military had eventually failed, largely due to opposition from powerful aristocrats and monks. The Tibetan government had little contact with other governments of the world during its period of de facto independence, with some exceptions, notably India, Great Britain, and the United States. This left Tibet diplomatically isolated and cut off to the point where it could not make its positions on the issues well known to the international community, and it was restricted by treaties that gave the British Empire authority over taxes, foreign relations and fortifications. Government of Tibet attempts to remain independent. In July 1949, in order to prevent Chinese agitation in political Tibet, the Tibetan government expelled the Chinese delegation. In November 1949, it sent a letter to the U.S. State Department and a copy to Mao Zedong, and a separate letter to Great Britain, declaring its intent to defend itself by all possible means against PRC troop incursions into Tibet. In the preceding 3 decades, the conservative Tibetan government had consciously de-emphasized its military and refrained from modernizing. Hasty attempts at modernizing and enlarging the military began in 1949, but proved mostly unsuccessful on both counts. It was too late to raise and train an effective army. India did provide some small arms aid and military training. However, the PLA remained much larger, better trained, better led, better equipped, and more experienced than the Tibetan army. In 1950, the 14th Dalai Lama was 15 years old and had not attained his majority, so Regent Taktra was the acting head of the Tibetan government. The period of the Dalai Lama's minority is traditionally one of instability and division, and the division and instability were made more intense by the recent Reading conspiracy and a 1947 regency dispute. Preparations by the People's Republic of China. Both the PRC and the predecessors, the Kuomintang, had always maintained that Tibet was a part of China. The PRC also proclaimed an ideological motivation to liberate the Tibetans from a theocratic feudal system. In September 1949, shortly before the proclamation of the People's Republic of China, the Chinese Communist Party made it a top priority to incorporate Tibet, Taiwan, Hainan Island, and the Pescadores into the PRC, peacefully or by force, because Tibet was unlikely to voluntarily give up its de facto independence. Mao, in December 1949, ordered that preparations be made to march into Tibet at Qamdo, in order to induce the Tibetan government to negotiate. The PRC had over 1 million men under arms and had extensive combat experience from the recently concluded Chinese Civil War. Negotiations between the Government of Tibet and the PRC prior to hostilities. On the 7th of March, a Tibetan delegation arrived in Kalimpong to open a dialogue with the newly declared PRC and to secure assurances that the PRC would respect Tibetan territorial integrity. Among other things, the onset of talks was delayed by a debate between the Tibetan delegation, India, Britain, and the PRC about the location of the talks. Tibet favored Singapore or Hong Kong, Britain favored India, and the PRC favored Beijing, but India and Britain preferred no talks at all. The Tibetan delegation did eventually meet with the PRC's Ambassador General Yuan Zhongshan in Delhi on the 16th of September 1950. Yuan communicated a 3-point proposal that Tibet be regarded as part of China, that China be responsible for Tibet's defense, and that China be responsible for Tibet's trade and foreign relations. Acceptance would lead to peaceful Chinese sovereignty, or otherwise war. The Tibetans undertook to maintain the relationship between China and Tibet as one of priest-patron. Tibet will remain independent as it is at present, and we will continue to have very close priest-patron relations with China. Also, there is no need to liberate Tibet from imperialism, since there are no British, American or Kuomintang imperialists in Tibet, and Tibet is ruled and protected by the Dalai Lama, Sepon W.D. Shakapa, and the head delegate Sepon W.D. Shakapa, on the 19th of September, recommended cooperation, with some stipulations about implementation. Chinese troops need not be stationed in Tibet, it was argued, since it was under no threat, and if attacked by India and Nepal could appeal to China for military assistance. While not deliberated, on the 7th of October, Chinese troops advanced into eastern Tibet, crossing the border at 5 places. The purpose was not to invade Tibet per se, but to capture the Tibetan army in Qamdo, demoralize the Lhasa government, and thus exert powerful pressure to send negotiators to Beijing to sign terms for a handover of Tibet. On the 21st of October, Lhasa instructed its delegation to leave immediately for Beijing for consultations with the communist government, and to accept the first provision if the status of the Dalai Lama could be guaranteed, while rejecting the other 2 conditions. It later rescinded even acceptance of the first demand. After a divination before the 6 armed Mahakala deities indicated that the 3 points could not be accepted, since Tibet would fall under foreign domination. Invasion of Tibet. After months of failed negotiations, attempts by Tibet to secure foreign support and assistance, and PRC in Tibetan troop build-ups, the People's Liberation Army crossed the Jinsha River on 6 of the 7th of October. 2 PLA units quickly surrounded the outnumbered Tibetan forces and captured the border town of Qamdo by the 19th of October, by which time 114 PLA soldiers and 180 Tibetan soldiers had been killed or wounded. Writing in 1962, Zhang Guohua claimed over 5,700 enemy men were destroyed, and more than 3,000 peacefully surrendered, though that appears to be hyperbole. Active hostilities were limited to a border area northeast of the Jiamo and Gulchu River and east of the 96th meridian. After capturing Qamdo, the PLA broke off hostilities, sent a captured commander, Nabo, to Lhasa to reiterate terms of negotiation, and waited for Tibetan representatives to respond through delegates to Beijing. Further negotiations and incorporation. The PLA sent released prisoners to Lhasa to negotiate with the Dalai Lama on the PLA's behalf. Chinese broadcasts promised that if Tibet was peacefully liberated, the Tibetan elites could keep the positions and power. At the same time, Jigme and other released captives testified to the good treatment by the PLA. The government of Tibet then sent representatives to Beijing to negotiate. El Salvador sponsored a complaint by the Tibetan government at the UN, but India and the United Kingdom prevented it from being debated. Tibetan negotiators were sent to Beijing and presented with an already finished document commonly referred to as the 17-point agreement. There was no negotiation offered by the Chinese delegation, although the PRC stated it would allow Tibet to reform at its own pace and in its own way, keep internal affairs self-governing and allow religious freedom. It would also have to agree to be part of China. The Tibetan negotiators were not allowed to communicate with their government on this key point, and pressured into signing the agreement on the 23rd of May 1951, despite never having been given permission to sign anything in the name of the government. This was the first time in Tibetan history its government had accepted, albeit unwillingly, China's position on the two nations' shared history. Tibetan representatives in Beijing and the PRC government signed the 17-point agreement on the 23rd of May 1951, authorizing the PLA presence and Central People's Government rule in political Tibet. The terms of the agreement had not been cleared with the Tibetan government before signing, and the Tibetan government was divided about whether it was better to accept the document as written or to flee into exile. The Dalai Lama, who by this time had ascended to the throne, chose not to flee into exile, and formally accepted the 17-point agreement in October 1951. According to Tibetan sources, on the 24th of October, on behalf of the Dalai Lama, General Zhang Jingwu sent a telegram to Mao Zedong with confirmation of the support of the agreement, and there is evidence that Napoe Nawang Jigme simply came to Zhang and said that the Tibetan government agreed to send a telegram on the 24th of October, instead of the formal Dalai Lama's approval. Shortly afterwards, the PLA peacefully entered Lhasa. Aftermath. For several years the Tibetan government remained in place in the areas of Tibet where it had ruled prior to the outbreak of hostilities, except for the area surrounding Qamdo that was occupied by the PLA in 1950, which was placed under the authority of the Qamdo Liberation Committee and outside the Tibetan government's control. During this time, areas under the Tibetan government maintained a large degree of autonomy from the central government and were generally allowed to maintain their traditional social structure. In 1956, Tibetan militias in the ethnically Tibetan region of Eastern Kham just outside the Tibetan Autonomous Region, spurred by PRC government experiments in land reform, started fighting against the government. When the fighting spread to Lhasa in 1959, the Dalai Lama fled Tibet. Both he and the PRC government in Tibet subsequently repudiated the 17-point agreement, and the PRC government in Tibet dissolved the Tibetan local government.